the name of my talk or presentation is there a chance for Russia to reinvent itself? In my presentation, I'll try to present some evidence which may affect the process of democratization of Russia in the future. On the first slide, you see the scene from a famous movie by Zyagintsev, Leviathan, which was released the same year, 2014. Russia intervened militarily in Ukraine. So there is a symbolism there, though what we have to talk today is that can Russia, as the title says, break with the history, break with the past, and become a democratic, peaceful, normal member of international system. Of course, the picture I will paint during my presentation will not be rosy, but for the listeners, I have to make a disclaimer from the beginning. I'm not speaking here as a Georgian who, because the Georgians have certain subjective views about Russia. But what I will try as an academician will try to present is some figures and numbers to show the current stage Russia is in, and also to stress from the beginning that we are interested in having Russia successful, because the success of Russia, economic success, success in democratic transition will make Russia peaceful rather than revanchist and revisionist as it is now. So, as David said, I'm professor at Ilia State University, and it's a privilege for me to be a colleague of David and others who made the presentations here. The starting point for my presentation is the following. Let's imagine that war is over. Ukraine restores its territorial integrity within international recognized borders of 91. And Russia is defeated. Russia is defeated, it might be very subjective phrase. It depends who perceives what and how. But what I mean here, the defeat of Russia, is that there is also perception in Russia itself that Russia has been defeated. And so what happens afterwards? So irrespectively, Putin remains in power, Putin is removed, and other leader, for example, Patrushev, is named by Western media as a possible successor of Putin, takes over. Irrespectively of that, what are the chances for Russia to be a democratic, peaceful country? This is the main question of my presentation. And here, presentation will consist of two parts. Some theoretical background in democratic theory, David already mentioned my interest in the subject, and I'll talk about that later on. I will quote some of my favorite authors in that regard. But on later, in the second part of my talk, I'll bring some data, World Bank development indicators, just to sustain the argument. Some theoretical background gives us to judge about Russia. So let me start with the famous Juan Linz and Alfred Stevens book, Problems of Democratic Transition and Consolidation. Book was published in '96, the year when, in the period when there was a variety of examples across the world from 50s and 60s. But when the former Soviet republics, including Russian Federation, was on the crossroads. So this is the Eltsins period, a period when there is economic decline in Russia, but the period when there is a hope in Russia and in the West and around the globe that Russia can be democratized. Here, I will refer also to my piece on the CRS blog about this perception about Russia, what was in 19th, 2000s or later, but I will not dwell into it right now. So what Juan Linz and Alfred Stevens propose, they propose the five criteria which may help the successful transition from authoritarian or totalitarian regimes to democracy. Though the precondition for these five is that no modern polity can become democratically consolidated unless it's a first state. Russia, as very heterogeneous state, has its own problems of statehood, and I will mention about them later on. But let's, for the moment, focus on the five per se. And from those five, the fifth one, institutionalized economy, is the one which is of my interest in this particular talk, and which I'd like to contribute the discussions we already had. So I'm sure there were already speakers, and will be tomorrow, who will speak better than me about the civil society or political society in Russia, about citizens' freedoms, etc., etc. But for me, the important part is the economic performance of Russia. So what links, when we're speaking about the statehood, Linz and Steven in this chart, which is in the red, say that with a presence of other nations on the territory of a titular nation, democracy consolidation may be difficult, not impossible, but may be difficult. In case there are nations present who are militant, like we had two Chechen wars on the Russian territory, that makes democratic consolidations highly implausible. But what I'd like to say is that let's imagine the scenario that there are no problems of statehood per se in Russia, that there are no factors like Chechnya or Tatarstan or Dagestan or others, which is a key point when the Russian leaders draw certain strategy and execute them. I'll return to these topics later on. Though just to mention already here, I was listening to Stephen Kotkin, the famous American historian, author of the book about the recent trilogy of Stalin, though we are still waiting the third volume of the trilogy. In the recent interview, Stephen Kotkin says that the problem of Russian leaders, including Stalin and Peter the Great and others, is the inherent weakness of Russia, not its strength. So what Kotkin says is that actually perpetual geopolitics is the one which changed all these leaders. So they build the statehood around the person because of the weakness. And here I would add the Russian reaction in the recent enlargement of NATO, namely Finland and Sweden. We expected, initial Putin's argument was that we will not we don't accept NATO enlargement, and that is one of the key reasons why Putin invaded Ukraine. The reaction on the enlargement of NATO, taking on the board Sweden and Finland, gives us an impression that this was not a problem for Russia. It was openly stated by Putin. It was openly stated by Lavrov. What might be an explanation? Explanation is quite simple. Russia does not care NATO on the borders where Russia does not feel vulnerable. But Georgia or Ukraine is the other cases, because exactly its south borders where Russia feels the vulnerability. So, and it's this vulnerability and the perception of a possible disintegration is what makes Russia very aggressive towards its southern or western neighbors, namely Georgia or Ukraine. So let's keep this in mind, though it's not the topic of my talk. And David, when I mentioned that I'd like to write a blog next week for CRS website, is exactly this topic, the vulnerability of Russia and the reaction to the recent announcement of NATO. But let's move on. Why Lin's and Stevens' book is also important for us? They name defeat in war as a prerequisite for possible regime change and democratic consolidation. I don't think that Russia is a totalitarian state for the moment. Definitely it is authoritarian. So the authors of the book, they name the defeat in war or war-related collapse as leading to democratic transition with weak negotiating power by prior non-democratic regime. So necessary conditions for the democratic consolidation. The fifth, as I mentioned, is the sufficient autonomy for economy and economic actors to assure pluralism of civil society, political society, and economic society. Here, what Linz and Steven prescribe is not sufficient for Russia. For example, they speak about the property privatization in Russia, which already happened in 90s. I think the current we have to look renew our outlook. What has to be done economically if Russia has to become a democratic country? By the way, I have to mention that when Putin came into power, he made quite important market-oriented reforms during the time when his team included Kudrin or German Gref or others. Flat income tax, 13%, and some other reforms contributed to the better economic performance. Of course, the energy prices, price of oil was the key factor, but the Putin made market-oriented some moves in the beginning of 2000s as well. But right now, if I would name what has to be done right now on the basis what the authors of the book proposes, this is decoupling state and energy sector, which is that state exits from the energy sector, which is, as we know, at least 60%, if not more, of Russian economy. Linz and Steven, they quote a very interesting book by Adam Przeworski and others. Actually, before the book, they published an article, Limonji and Przeworski, they published an article which speaks about potential for a regime to sustain democratic consolidation or to survive the process of democratic transition. And they speak, for example, that no non-democratic regime survive more than 3 years of consecutive negative growth. Let's remember this because it's important for our final analysis. But definitely, if we are speaking about the survival of democratic regime and whatever the name we can attach to Eltsin's Russia, let's say it was a hybrid democracy, of course not consolidated. Of course, its survival was hampered by the world financial crisis of '98. We all remember, for example, when prior to that, Eltsin brought Nemtsov into the cabinet from the governorial post. And unfortunately, because of the government resigned after the collapse of Russian ruble, and Nemtsov resigned too. Though some people think that he could be a next leader of Russia, not Vladimir Putin. But this is just speculation from some of the authors. But again, Przeworski especially is the author who is, as we speak about the theoretical background, who draws a causal dependence of democratic consolidation on economic development. He is the one of the many scholars who believe that certain preconditions must exist in order to have a fragile democracy consolidated. And here are some of the elements from his another article, where he says that it's difficult to start a democratic transition in poor countries. They are more likely to be started in countries at middle income levels, and again, least likely if dictatorship exists in a country with high level of per capita income. So another factors, which is, but even though Przeworski says that that democratic consolidation depends on democratic development level as well, none of the recent authors argue that this is the sole or only factor, and they list some other factors which are important. Though Przeworski is the one who says that main precursor for democratic consolidation anyway is a certain level of democratic development. About the survival, so these were the points to have a regime change and to have the transition kick off. But for the survival, there are very interesting few other points. As we said, and Linz and Steven quoted Przeworski, as we they studied thousands of countries, and again they repeat, the Przeworski repeats that no democracy ever, including the period before World War II, fell into a country with a per capita income higher than of Argentina in 1975. Later, I will quote some other authors, and they refer to Argentina. So in the literature, Argentina is the reference point for the authors as a threshold for democratic consolidation. I'll compare later Russia and Argentina, but here already I can tell you that Russia in 2000, when Putin comes to power, was well below the threshold. So it was practically determined that Russia as a hybrid democracy will not survive and will turn into the authoritarian regime that Putin built for last 20 or 22 years. And by the way, Russia reached the threshold in 2019, exactly before corona pandemic, and exactly before Putin's isolation became extreme. Now, many commentators say that before there is very close circle after pandemics Putin is talking to. The second for survival democratic regimes is the education. Education elevates the probability that democracy would survive. And in the second part, when I show certain figures from World Bank database, education will be one of the important one for that. Economic growth is not correlated highly with survival democracy. So democratic regimes or autocratic regimes can survive or collapse in both ways, with a high economic growth and with economic stagnation. Gini coefficient is important factor besides education. So we speak about the economic situation, and GDP per capita will be our determinant. Education, Gini coefficient, how it's distributed across the society, from poorest quintile or decile to the richest. I'll omit some of the elements here, which are more political, religious, cultural factors. It's not a core of my presentation, though I'll speak about cultural factors later on when we start challenging those actors who speak mainly about the socio-economic factors for the democratic consolidation. And finally, the point 9 is the reason older democracies are more likely to survive is thus that their economies grow in the meantime. It is again income that explains arrival, not some kind of habituation. What Przeworski says here, that though short-term economic growth might be not relevant for the regime change or regime survival, in the long run, of course, democracies are better for economic growth. And of course, back to the Linz and Stevens book, when they discuss either Spain, Portugal, Greece consolidation, or they speak the Latin American consolidations, or they speak the third wave countries consolidations, they always point out, they always bring in their charts the data, are people satisfied with efficiency of democracy or not? But let's omit that for the moment. Growth of the population. This is also important when we will be speaking. Why I'll bring this here is that when I'll show you certain data about Russia, it's important to keep in mind also what theorists say about generally. For example, we will see that Russia is an exception for this, that Russia is a declining in terms of population. It's not growing. Which again proves that whatever the theories we choose, Russia is not the country which easily fits to any or another theory. When I spoke about the books of 80s or 90s, the some theories, but the inception of the theory, the linkage between the economic development and democratic consolidations, started with the seminal book by Lipset. Actually, it's not a book; it's an article from 59. Some social requisites of democracy, economic development, and political legitimacy. Lipset definitely says that increased wealth is not only related causally to the development of democracy, but what he argues is that large middle class plays a mitigating role. I mean, he speaks a lot about the large middle class and he speaks about the importance of certain economic development in order to have the middle class, which is the basis for further democratization and democratic consolidation. So actually, it was Lipset who gave a birth to this theory, and the authors like Przeworski and others. And here, for example, in that article, Lipset speaks about per capita income, and he distinguishes between European democracies and unstable democracies and dictatorship, the second line on horizontal, and Latin America. And you see the difference in per capita income in the red square. In the green square is the measurement. These are indices of wealth in general, but why I differentiate between the three, red, green, and blue, is that red I perceive as purely economic, green I perceive as societal, like, for example, how many persons per doctor, or how many doctors per 1,000 persons, how many telephones, how many radios, though we can attribute radios also to the last part, to the blue one. Newspapers is more civic element here, when I will speak about the Robert Putnam, which I translated from in my previous life in the beginning of 2000s, the book. I will refer to it later on. Civicness, of course, affects, though it's not topic of my talk, but this is the Lipset's framework he's working in. These are, just to save the time, these are another authors from 99 articles, like Przeworski continues the path started by Lipset. And they, in that article, speaking about inflation and GDP growth in post-communist countries of Eastern Europe. There are 10 countries here. And here also in the green box, I'd like to keep your attention one additional element here, which is migration. So whether you have brain drain, or you have the return for immigrants back to the country. So you have outflow or inflow. It affects not only economic performance, but democratic consolidation or development as well. And we will talk about this later on as well. So keep in mind this migration element. This is when we will be speaking about the very important book and article by Ivan Krasser and Siren Holtz. Now let's talk a little bit about authors who challenged Lipset's argument that economic development is important. Famous authors Acemoglu and Robinson, whom we know, very popular book, Why Nations Fail. They published several articles in the beginning of 2000s, and later on the book in 2005 and 2006, when they challenged the Lipset's main argument about the prerequisite of a certain economic development. For example, they say that democracy were incepted in many countries of the old democracies when they've been very poor from the point of current standards. So it's not, there is variety of discussion in academic sphere about the correlation between democracy and economic development. So there is no clear-cut decision on that among academicians. And by the way, it's important to take note that Acemoglu and Robinson, and with them some other authors refer to the period of 1960 and 2000. These 40 years, we are really, if you check certain economic development and its correlation with democracy, the Lipset argument does not hold, and it has to be taken into account. So from another school, the book I mentioned, which I translated into Georgians, is that how to make democracy work. And what this book is about, Italy, a comparison of North Italy and South Italy, and 25 long study, which started in 70 and lasted till 93 when the book was published. And the study was including research includes quantitative as well as qualitative analysis, as well as and historic analysis of the difference between northern regions of Italy and south regions of Italy. There are vast volume of literature on that. But what Putnam and their collaborators showed is that, of course, there is a correlation between economic modernity and institutional performance. These are the charts from the book. So in the upper right hand, you have the the regions of Italy performing well after the regional reform of 1970, and lower left hand square is where the Sicily or Campania or Calabria and or Bari locates, and the same is with the correlation between civicness of the communities and the regions and institutional performance. And you see that civicness correlates more than economic modernity. So Putnam belongs to the trend which challenges, which says that civicness has much more weight in democratic consolidation than economic performance. I know that you want to see the Russian data, but a few more slides about that. Again, our conversations cannot go without mentioning Mike McFaul. Michael McFaul is very prominent from his period when he was an ambassador to Russia, but he became even prominent now as the one who is the member of the group which works on sanctioning Russian oligarchs. This is the just to continue Putnam's argument. This is the chart where McFaul says that from most of its history, Russia was authoritarian or totalitarian regime, but he continues repeating in his articles and statements that the history is not a destiny, and choosing autocracy, it was a decision by Putin and his circle, and not determined by all the factors, which is, if we will see some economic data, which I think is some weak argument from my point of view. Just to continue talking about the cultural issues. Here I would say, here, and look at the Engelhard Weitzel World Cultural Map. Russia is not in a bad shape here. Russia is as secular as Austria, for example, or on the survival self-expression values horizontal axis. Russia is somewhere where the South Korea is. So the starting point from Russia, from cultural point of view, what is the cultural norms in the society, Russia has a ground for democratic transition and later for consolidation. Look where Georgia is. Russia is better located than Georgia for moving to the right and up. And by the way, in 2009 article, the both authors, Engelhard and Weitzel, they speak about how development leads to democracy, and what we know. The title is "What We Know About Modernization." They again mention economic level of Argentina, which is the minimum prerequisite for democracy to survive, and they analyze the data from countries from 1970 to 90. So I promise that I'll show you Argentina and Russia. Here it is. So if we take GDP per capita constant in 2011 US dollars, in 2009, when Weitzel and Engelhard published this article in Foreign Affairs, Russia was still below Argentina. This is gapminder.org. I would, if somebody wants to compare countries on various dimensions, I highly recommend this website, gapminder.org. But interestingly, Argentina itself was not much moving in economic terms. On life expectancy, the vertical axis, you see that it raised. But on economic terms, there was not much movement for Argentina itself. Let's now compare for the last 25 years, Russia and Argentina. Orange is Argentina, blue is Russia. And though Russia grew significantly and almost closed the gap, this is, let me see, in 2001. This is constant 2015 US dollars. I'll show you Russian numbers in power purchasing parity numbers. But looking from outside, just to compare the countries on the world scene, not talking about how much Russian and Argentinian can buy at home, which is measured by PPP, this tells us that despite the growth Russia achieved since '97, it's still below Argentina. This is pre-war, so this is not without a prediction. What IMF and World Bank predicts that this year Russia will drop -8%, -10%, and will continue dropping next year and maybe after. It depends on the effect of sanctions and how long be kept. Again, just to compare countries here. Compare Russia on one hand, Argentina on the other hand, and in between Europe and Central Asia, high-income countries, upper middle-income countries, and European Union. So today, Russia is counted as it moved at certain point to high-income countries. It dropped to upper middle-income countries. So you will see that where Russia stands in economic terms. So again, we have to answer. Finally, we have to answer: is there a background economically for Russia that democracy takes a root and develops in Russia? Now let's move on. I'll drop Argentina in my next slides, and I'll continue, as I said, with just to show how Russia grew in Putin's years. Of course, again, I repeat, this is the oil prices and gas prices which contributed to that mostly, and we see that from 2014, 13-14, there is certain stagnation and the best years for Russia was from 2000 and 2008. And again, I'll show you the McFall's chart, but next to the chart, what was the quote by McFall, that actually what this economic growth contributed mostly to the Putin's popularity. This is widely shared thesis, and of course nobody can challenge that seeing that chart. So in terms of the purchasing power, Russia is above the upper middle income countries. As you see, it's up to the 30,000 USD in current international dollars. Now, and this is how the GDP per capita grew in power purchasing parity terms over the years. So again, I quoted McFall. This is a quote from another his article, which I highly recommend. Is Putin is the Russian norm or an aberration? And he says that Putin remained popular not so much for those policy decisions, but first and foremost because of the economic growth. So you see that there was economic growth there just before I moved to education and healthcare. It was there, but not at the level to reach the so-called Argentina threshold. And what this economic growth contributed to was the consolidation of Putin authoritarianism rather than moving towards democratic, changing to the democratic development. Education. This is how much countries spend from GDP as a percentage of GDP on education, blue, on healthcare, orange, and on military, gray. And you see that Russia does not care much about the health care, and we will see some other figures, spends more than others on military, but is on peer on education. So we could say that education is the one where Russia is not the same. This is the figures, government expenditure from total government expenditure. So there is a state or regional or local budgets, and what is spent by government from the public finances on education, healthcare, and military, and the trends are the same as in the previous slide. So, by the way, just on military, which is important, this is the chart from Linz and Stevens' book. How much from GDP USSR was spending on defense, 23% of GDP. So this is, of course, it's not the same as was before, but Russia still is, as we know, very militarized country, and these are the figures just to know. So during the Putin's years, Russian military expenditure remained almost the same, above around 11%. So half than Soviet Union, but very high. No, it's 23 was from GDP. This is the 11% from general government expenditure. So important to know that it almost remained a constant in all Putin's years. Now, and armed personnel as a percentage of total labor force, because in literature, it's not only important the GDP per capita and income in general, but what workforce gets as an income. And least productive jobs are, least income they have, and they may lead to the instability of the regime. So first, Russia has the high percentage of the armed personnel of total labor force. And this is very important chart on education, the quality of the educated labor force. You see that, unfortunately, there was no data about the upper middle income countries, but you see that Russian Federation is behind European Union, high-income countries, or countries of the region, Europe and Central Asia, in terms that from the labor force with advanced education, from the total population of advanced education is lower, which is the blue, and the same applies to the basic education. So education does not translate into the labor, and it might be also the reason why big portion of a society, especially in rural areas, might be alienated completely from a social or societal fabric shown in Zhuyagintsev's brilliant movie. Now, in the previous slides, I showed you importance of migration. Some of the authors refer to migration. This is the Krastev and Stephen Holmes, about they are talking about Eastern Europe, what gave a chance to far-right movements and certain leaders in Eastern Europe, like Viktor Orban, for example. And one of the explanations they give is that the middle-aged, well-educated people who must be a backbone of the middle class, they prefer to leave the country and have a career in developed countries rather than to spend at least part of their energy and resources on transformation of its own country. And here we see numbers for Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, East Germany, East Germans moving to the West Germany, Romania. I mean, not every country has a leader currently like Viktor Orban, but what Krastev and Holmes argue is that democratic consolidation becomes difficult, or even there is a backsliding, when you have the exodus from the country, and those who must be bearers of the transformation, they leave the country, and who is remaining are mostly government dependent, socially vulnerable, elder generation who has certain cultural and historic stereotypes. So brain drain is a very important factor to take into account. And of course, when we are talking about Russia, the current exodus, massive exodus from Russia of middle-class Russians to Georgia or Armenia or Kazakhstan or Poland or Cyprus or elsewhere or Dubai is and will be a key factor. We will come back to this later on. If you remember, I mentioned from a theoretical background, I mentioned Gini index. And by the way, we have to admit that during Putin's times, Gini index improved. So it lowered. But now it means that the economic growth, which happened in Russia for the last 25 years, after collapse of the 90s, it was somehow also was distributed across the different segments of society. And that's why vulnerability of Putin's regime increases. So, because we have to expect that with the economic downturn, the Gini index will revert and will increase. And how it affects country, we can judge from the example of Georgia. We had not directly linked with Gini index. Gini index in Georgia never went below 39. It remained up to 39, 44 years, irrespectively of the regime. It was Rose Revolution or Georgian Dream regimes, it remained high. But generally, I would argue that current consolidation of authoritarianism in Georgia is also due to the fact that from certain prosperous years, society economically went down, and it created frustration, apathy, again, massive exodus from the country, as the recent data reveals. So, and that's why it's not only Russia in coming years, but already Georgia in recently becomes a quite a difficult place for democratic transformation, not only democratic transformation, not only consolidation, but democratic transformation. Now moving to healthcare. Healthcare and data on healthcare. David, I see that I'm already speaking an hour, but I need some 10, 15 minutes more. I think we will leave the room for questions. So
it's totally up to you.
Yeah.
Zura,
So
you have 50 minutes. Of course, participants would like to then engage in discussion
and challenge
some
of the arguments. Yes, I'll move quickly now. The healthcare and some social indicators are the one where we see that Russia is a hollow superpower, as economists once pictured it. So again, it's only Russia which spends more on military than on health, both from GDP here and from the total government expenditure. Now, if we take the risk of catastrophic expenditure for surgical care, which means that these people does not have enough money if they go for the surgery, does not have enough money to have a surgery, or surgery brings them down below poverty line. So surgery means impoverishment of a family or of a person. You see that high risk of Russians in there, even twice more than in other upper middle income countries on average. So, and it lowered in the high growth years from 2003 to 2008, but it remains constant since then. So you will see results of that in other. Life expectancy. You see the other countries, but in slides mostly I compare Russian Federation and upper middle income countries. Georgia belongs also to upper middle income country. It's female and males. In female years are, we could say, the same, but male years are terribly, terribly low. And if we go far east, it goes below. If we take the regions by regions, in Siberia, it's below 60. Mortality from cardiovascular diseases, cancer, diabetes. So you see that in case of Russia, and especially the Russian males, is extremely high. And mortality attributed to unintentional poisoning, you see the numbers. Suicide mortality is very, very high. These are all data from 2019. So all this data tells you that we had in Russia economic growth, but it was not translated into the improvement, for example, in healthcare and some others as well, I'll show. Probability of dying among children, adolescents of various ages, youth. Again, these are the These are the numbers. In some numbers are on par with upper middle countries, but much worse than high income European Union or on average Europe and Central Asian countries. Survival age of age till 65, females and males, and you see males are 61%. So 61% of males have a chance to survive until 65. Putin survived that because of the care he takes. But this is the general situation in the country. Incidence of tuberculosis. So again, I mean, we can, unfortunately, I couldn't find data on HIV AIDS, but as we know, in the beginning of 2000s, since then it improved a little bit, there was an explosion of HIV in Russia, and it was a serious problem for the country and for the region. Intentional homicides. And Russia, unfortunately, is a leader here as well. So all this tells you something about Russia, quality of life there. I'm not talking about Moscow, I'm not talking about St. Petersburg and some other big cities, but in Russia in general. Population growth. You remember from theoretical background, I spoke about that dictatorship is, in dictatorship we have a higher population growth than in democracies, because democracy, when it creates opportunities for women, of course, fertility rates drop, birth rates drop, though in democracies mortality rates drops, but birth rates drops as well. So in dictatorships, in authoritarian regimes, mortality rates are high, but because women have no other options, just to be housewives and least opportunities for them, birth rates are higher. It's not true for Russia. In Russia, we have population decrease rather than growth, and these are the years. So only few years Russia had a growth, annual growth. Otherwise, it has dropped in the population, and death rates are comparably high. Let's look now some, again, quality of life or standard of life data. People using at least basic sanitation services. Entire population, rural and urban. Look at rural population. It's below than in other upper middle income countries on average. Not talking about the European Union or high income countries or Europe and Central Asia countries. People using safely managed, not basic, but safely managed sanitation services in general. Again, Russia is on par with upper middle income countries. So it's a hollow superpower, really, as economists described. And despite, this graph shows you that despite the economic growth and hundreds of billions of USD coming from energy sector, from oil and gas export, these sanitation services in rural areas improved only a little bit, by 10 percentage points for both, at least basic and safely managed sanitation services. So Putin invested a lot in military, but not in healthcare or public services like sanitation services, especially in rural areas. Drinking water services. Safely managed drinking water services, you see the numbers. So all these numbers tell you that living standards are not on par with high income or European Union countries. Russia is at odds with the current war in Ukraine. Again, is there a chance for Russia to reinvent herself? In his article, Choosing Autocracy, Makfall says that after Gorbachev initiated transformation, Russia had to transform herself in 3 dimensions: empire to nation state, dictatorship to democracy, and common planned economy to capitalism. And the problem is, and Makfall says that this 3-dimensional task is very, very difficult to manage. And that's why he says that the imperial totalitarian command economy legacy did not determine democratic failure, but most certainly lowered the odds of success. Unfortunately, Russia is at the same crossroads after the war in Ukraine is over, luckily, with the defeat of the aggressor. Again, coming to the conclusions, let's imagine that there is no other nations present and vacant on the Russian territory, Russian Federation's territory. So let's imagine that it's a not heterogeneous, but homogeneous country. Let's imagine that there is no FSB, KGB security apparatus. Let's imagine that there is no Stalin, Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, and other icons in the public discourse. There is no course of history, as Robert Putnam says. There is no third Rome ideology. And taking only income, GDP per capita, education, and in general, socioeconomic factors makes Russia's transition to democracy, let alone the survival of that democracy, weak democracy, least plausible. This is very unfortunate, but we have to take into consideration that, again, no non-democratic regime survived more than 3 years of consecutive negative growth. And we may expect, because of war and sanctions, Russia having 3 years even more consecutive negative growth. This may lead to, and this is my main argument, this may lead to regime change, but will reduce the likelihood of democratic transition. So this will be a kind of 19th volume 2, and especially for those layers of society whose conditions being improved, the second downturn will devastate them psychologically in a way that it's very difficult to imagine how they will stand on their feet again. So, though Russia reached Argentina threshold, this downturn will make Russia below the threshold again. Importantly, outflow of the educated middle class, especially employed in the service sector, which is high income, most productive sector, will be another impediment for Russia's democratic transition. I mean, these are the people who has to be carriers of transformation, but unfortunately they leave Russia, and it is doubtful that they will go back in years soon. And who will remain, as Krastev and Holmes say, who will remain? They will be vulnerable to ideologized history and propaganda, which will remain in Russia irrespectively Putin remains in power or not.